The first ever China-Africa Economic and Trade Expo opened in Changsha, capital of central China's Hunan province, on Thursday. Its aim is to put into action plans outlined by Chinese President Xi Jinping during a 2018 summit on China-Africa cooperation. So how do local governments and businesses integrate into the China-Africa cooperation plan? And how is this expo expected to facilitate Africa's fast industrialization while pushing forward China's continued economic globalization? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Changsha, Hunan, on the sidelines of this expo. I'll be conducting exclusive interviews with Chinese and African participants to this expo, as well as hosting a panel discussion on investment in Africa. My guest today is Professor Justin Yifu, former Senior Vice President of the World Bank and now a Senior Advisor to the Chinese government on economic affairs. So, Professor Lin, thank you very much for joining us today. Let's first talk a little bit about this expo. According to the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, the expo will be turned into a new mechanism for commercial cooperation with Africa, a new platform to deliver the trade and economic measures of FOCAC, which is the mechanism for China-Africa cooperation, and a new window for subnational business cooperation with Africa. Exactly what does these new mean for you?
Well, that means a new commitment for the Chinese government to have a friendly trade economic relations with African countries. And I'm sure this new mechanism, new platform will be a landmark for the cooperation and development in China and in Africa.
But exactly what does this expo aim to do? To bring local businesses together? Why is it in such a place in central China, in Hunan, and why are local businesses so much encouraged to participate?
I think that one of the main reasons is that Hunan is a landlocked province and also an agricultural province. And so the experiences of economic development in Hunan province can provide, on the one hand, good aspiration, on the other hand, good experiences for African countries in their pursuit of economic development. And certainly, if we want to have a cooperation, we need to have the actors. And the actors are private sectors, private business. But the government set up the platform for them to meet, to explore the opportunities of cooperation.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about Africa could be the next China, saying that there are many similarities between China and African countries. For instance, we all came from a very low starting point, right? China had a very low per capita income. And we also had a kind of, I translated into newcomer advantage, 后发优势. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit exactly what do these similarities mean for China and for African countries in their joining hands to help each other?
First, we need to have a confidence. Even a country, a place, are trapped in poverty for a century. As long as the ideals is right, then they can turn from poverty to prosperity within one generation or 2 generations' time. Mm-hmm. China and the Hunan provinces demonstrate that effects. And secondly, a country in the process of their development to be inclusive and sustainable, they should develop their economy according to their competitive advantages. And in a market economy, with the facilitation of the government to help the private sectors to turn the comparative advantages into competitive advantages. And if they can do that, they have economists named as latecomers advantage.
Latecomers advantage.
Because at this process, they can learn the experiences and the technologies from more advanced countries in their process of technological innovation and industrial upgrading. And that is the reason why China has been able to achieve 9.4% growth since the reform started in 1978.
Would you like to elaborate a little bit or maybe give some examples? For instance, you have worked in Africa, you have worked in the economic sector for decades. In what sector, for instance, you would say the balance that you talked about between the role of the market and the role of the state is playing a pivotal role in Africa now?
We need to trace the idea of economic development from a historical perspective. After the Second World War, the former colonies were semi-colonies. They gained political independence, started to pursue their own industrialization and modernization. And in the first generation of development ideals, they emphasized the role of the state to develop the advanced, capital-intensive, large-scale industries. And certainly, the understanding at the time, if you wanted to be a high-income country, you need to have the advanced industries. And then in the 1980s, 1990s, every country tries to transit from the government-led growth to a market economy. At that time, they neglect the role of the state, only emphasize the role of the market in the process of economic transition, in the process of economic development. And if you look into country, you follow those kind of ideals, their economic performance deteriorated. The average annual growth rate of the developing country in the 1980s, 1990s actually was lower than the annual GDP growth rate in 1960s, 1970s. And not only so, the frequencies of economic crisis in the 1980s, 1990s was even higher than the frequencies of the 1960s and 1970s. And so some economists refer the 1980s, 1990s as the lost decades for the developing country. And you can see in the both two generational development ideals, either emphasize the role of state, either emphasize the role of the market.
What's the picture now?
And I think that if we look into a few successful countries, like China, Vietnam, and to some extent also Mauritius in Africa, they perform much better than the average. And you can see, no matter in the process of economic development or in the process of economic transition, certainly they move towards market, but at the same time the government always played very important proactive role. And that is what we learn from the history, and also that is the wisdom that we gained in the process of economic transition in China.
Do you think that is also one of the reasons why some African or the great majority of African countries are very much interested in stepping up cooperation with China? Because not just for the trading opportunities, not just for the infrastructure, but the inspiration and possible lessons to learn from China.
Very true. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, China provides an aspiration for African countries. China was trapped in poverty for a century. When the transition from a planned economy to a market economy started in 1978, that is 41 years ago, China was much poorer than African countries. China was trapped in poverty for a century. But in the past 40 years, China has been a super performer in terms of economic development. And I think they are inspired because every country want to be successful. Every country try to make their people rich, their country strong, and China provides this kind of aspiration as well as some experiences to share with African friends.
That is a very contentious issue, however, in the eyes of many Westerners, because they think that the China model is finding its audiences, is finding its market, and that China is probably trying to project its way of governance and so on and so forth. How would you look at the competition of different models of development and the legitimacy and the long-term vitality of the Chinese model?
Well, as Mr. Deng Xiaoping said, no matter white cat or black cat, as long as it can catch mouse, it's a good cat.
What is the mouse here?
The mouse is economic development, creating jobs, generate export, diversify the economy, and make growth inclusive and sustainable to fulfill the aspiration of the people to become rich, to make the nation strong. As long as the economic model can help our country to achieve those kind of dreams, then this model is a good model. And the African countries, after the Second World War, they gained political independence. They started to pursue their own economic modernization, industrialization, and they follow the ideals, the models from the West, from the advanced country. But the result has been very disappointing. And if the Chinese experiences, Chinese wisdom can help the African country, it's good for the African country, but actually it's also good for the world.
Are these two kinds of wisdoms, let's say, contradictory, mutually exclusive?
Well, not necessary, but we know any kind of experiences or theories, always depends on the preconditions. The experiences and a theory from the advanced country, generated from the experiences of the high-income country, and explicitly or implicitly, those kind of theory take the condition, the stage of development in high-income country as the preconditions. In the African country or other low-income country, their preconditions certainly are different from the high-income country. And as a result, those kind of theory, superficially seem to be very conventional. But if you follow those kind of theory, because conditions are not there, and as a result, good intention may not bring the good results. And the Chinese experiences, Chinese wisdom, because we are a developing country, and our conditions are more similar to other developing countries. And as a result, this kind of wisdom, this kind of experiences can be a much better reference for the African country to chart their own path of development and to really explore their competitive advantages and to help them to, generate jobs and diversify their economy to make their growth inclusive and sustainable.
At the end of the day, it's African countries who will see according to their own self-interest. Thank you so much, Professor Justin Yifu, Dean of the Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development.
Thank you very much, Xin.
Thank you.